The gavel crack didn't just sound, it felt like a physical blow against the stagnant, over refrigerated air of the courtroom, a sharp punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I had been writing for 2 decades. All rise, the bailiff intoned, his voice a gravelly drone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards beneath my sensible pumps. I stood, my spine a rigid line of tempered steel, feeling the familiar weight of the manila folder beneath my palm. Beside me, Julian rose with a fluid, practiced grace, his movements polished by years of boardrooms and expensive scotch. He didn't just stand, he occupied the space, his presence an intentional intrusion. He leaned slightly toward me, the scent of his sandalwood cologne, the one I'd picked out for his 45th birthday, clinging to the air between us like a suffocating shroud. "You're finished, Elena," he whispered, the words barely a breath, yet carrying the jagged edge of a serrated blade. He didn't look at me. He looked straight ahead at the bench, his jaw set in that specific expression of noble stoicism he used when he was about to crush an opponent. He thought I was the opponent. He didn't realize I was the architect. Judge Eleanor Vance took her seat, her robes billowing like dark wings before settling into the high-backed leather chair. She was a woman who looked as though she were carved from the very mahogany of the bench she sat behind, unyielding, observant, and entirely unimpressed by the theater of the wealthy. She adjusted her glasses, the fluorescent lights overhead glinting off the lenses, and began to shuffle through the filings. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the smell of old paper, floor wax, and the desperate, metallic tang of Julian's ambition. I watched his hand as it rested on the table, specifically the heavy gold signet ring on his pinky. It was a family heirloom, he claimed, a symbol of the Sterling legacy. In reality, I had redeemed it from a pawn shop in upstate New York 3 months after we were married, using the secret savings my grandmother had left me. He had forgotten that detail, just as he had forgotten that I was the one who balanced the books when Sterling Logistics was nothing more than 2 rusted trucks and a lease we couldn't afford. His lawyer, Marcus Thorne, a man whose tan was as artificial as his empathy, cleared his throat and stood. "Your Honor, my client seeks a swift resolution. The prenuptial agreement is ironclad. Mrs. Sterling is entitled to the settlement outlined in 2004 and not a penny more. The company, the holdings, and the estate are solely the property of Julian Sterling." Marcus flashed a smile that was meant to be reassuring but looked more like a threat. I felt the familiar spark of anger, but I dampened it, letting the cold, hard logic of my preparation take over. Julian's laughter from moments ago still echoed in my ears, a low, condescending sound that assumed my defeat was a foregone conclusion. He thought he had spent the last year hiding assets in offshore accounts and shell companies. He thought he had successfully transferred the majority of Sterling Logistics voting shares to a holding firm in Delaware to keep them out of the divorce reach. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom as he sat there in his charcoal suit, was that I had been watching the breadcrumbs. I hadn't just watched them, I had paved the path they followed. For 3 years, I had played the role of the dutiful, slightly distracted wife, while quietly becoming the anonymous majority shareholder of the very holding firm he thought was his sanctuary. Every time he stole from our marital assets to fortify his empire against me, he was inadvertently handing me the keys to the kingdom. The folder under my hand wasn't just evidence of his infidelity or his financial trickery, it was the deed to his life. Judge Vance looked up from the papers, her sharp eyes landing on my attorney, Sarah Jenkins. "Mrs. Sterling, do you have a response to the validity of the 2004 agreement?" Sarah stood, her movements calm and deliberate, She didn't look at Marcus, and she didn't look at Julian. She looked only at the judge. Your Honor, Sarah began, her voice clear and resonant, we aren't contesting the prenuptial agreement today. We are, however, introducing new evidence regarding the current ownership structure of Sterling Logistics and its parent companies. It appears there has been a significant change in the landscape of Mr. Sterling's sole property. I felt Julian stiffen beside me. The air in the room seemed to thin, the hum of the air conditioning suddenly deafening. He turned his head just a fraction, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read my expression. I gave him nothing. I remained a statue, a ghost of the woman he thought he had broken, waiting for the moment the trap would finally spring shut. The judge gestured for the documents. This was the moment of impact, the point where the trajectory of our lives would diverge forever, and I was the one holding the compass. The weight of 20 years of silence was finally about to lift, and the sound of its departure would be deafening. Sarah Jenkins moved with a grace that Julian had always mistaken for simple compliance. The folders she slid across the mahogany bench were thick, bound in a deep navy cardstock that looked almost black under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the courtroom. I watched Judge Vance's fingers, long, elegant, and steady, as she reached out to take them. There was a faint, heavy thud when the documents hit the wood, a sound that felt like a gavel strike in the silent chambers of my mind. Beside me, Julian's breathing had changed. It was no longer the rhythmic, bored huff of a man waiting for a tedious chore to end. It was shallow, hitched in the back of his throat. He shifted in his seat, the expensive wool of his charcoal suit whispering against the leather chair, a sound that reminded me of a snake moving through dry grass. Marcus Thorne lined in, his brows furrowed, his practiced mask of artificial empathy flickering for the briefest of seconds as he tried to catch a glimpse of the top page. My mind drifted then, pulled back by the sheer weight of the history we were currently dismantling. I remembered the very beginning, long before the charcoal suits and the mahogany courtrooms, back when our world was measured in square inches rather than square miles. We started in a third-floor walk-up that smelled eternally of burnt toast and the neighbors' cheap cigars. Our dining table was nothing more than 3 cardboard boxes from a local grocery store, stacked together and covered with a frayed white sheet I'd found at a thrift store. We called it Vanguard Logistics back then, a name that sounded far more prestigious than the reality of our situation. Julian would spend our last $100 on a silk tie and an expensive lunch at the pier just to look the part for potential investors, leaving me to survive on cold coffee and the adrenaline of pure necessity. I was the one who sat in the corner of that cramped living room until 3 in the morning, my fingers cramped and calloused from typing out every single line of our first corporate charter on a keyboard that stuck every time I hit the S key. I could still feel the phantom vibration of that labor in my joints. I was the architect of the supply chain routes, staring at paper maps until the lines blurred into a red and blue web of possibilities, negotiating over a static-filled phone line with grizzled, skeptical vendors who didn't want to talk to a woman but couldn't argue with my logic or my numbers. Julian was the face, the charismatic visionary who charmed the rooms I built for him, but I was the engine buried deep in the basement, the one keeping the pistons firing while he took the credit for the speed. When we finally moved out of the apartment and into our first rented warehouse, the scent of it became the perfume of my daily life. It was a sharp, biting odor of vulcanized rubber, stale diesel, and the metallic, dusty tang of raw ambition. It was drafty and dim, the windows coated in a layer of grime that even the strongest rain couldn't wash away, but to me, it was a cathedral of our making. I remember walking the perimeter, my heels clicking on the oil-stained concrete, while Julian stood at the loading dock posing for a local business journal photographer. He looked so confident, so self-made, as he stood there in the light. It was in that warehouse, watching him charm a reporter while I stayed in the shadows recalculating a fuel tax error he'd overlooked, that I first truly understood his nature. He didn't see me as a partner or a co-founder. He viewed my intellect and my labor as a natural resource like coal or timber, something he was entitled to harvest until the ground was barren. He assumed the well would never run dry, and he never imagined I would eventually start charging him for the water. Now, in the heavy silence of the courtroom, I watched the realization begin to bleed into his expression, a slow motion car crash of the ego. Judge Vance flipped a page, her eyes scanning the ownership percentages of Aegis Holdings, the shell company Julian had spent 18 months carefully constructing to funnel 40% of Sterling's equity away from our marital estate. She paused, her gaze lingering on a specific name listed as the sole proprietor of Aegis. My name wasn't there, not my legal one anyway. It was Clarice P. Endeavor, a name taken from my grandmother's middle name and the title of the very first cargo ship I'd ever chartered for Vanguard. Julian didn't recognize the name yet, but he recognized the numbers, and he recognized the cold, clinical precision of the filing. I saw his hand on the table begin to tremble just a fraction. The heavy gold signet ring, the one I had saved from a pawn shop with my own grandmother's money, caught the light. He had built his entire identity on the lie that he was the sole creator of this empire, forgetting that every brick had been laid by my hands. He thought he was playing a game of chess against a pawn, never realizing I had been the one who carved the board and set the clock. The silence that followed my internal monologue was the kind that had weight, a physical pressure that seemed to make the very air in the courtroom grow thin. It was a silence I had cultivated over decades, the quiet of a woman who had learned that the most powerful person in the room is often the one who says the least. Julian's lead attorney, Marcus Thorne, a man whose skin possessed the permanent, artificial glow of a high-end tanning bed and whose suits cost more than our first 3 delivery trucks combined, leaned in toward Julian. I watched the frantic movement of Thorne's jaw, the way his eyes darted between the thick stack of documents on the judge's bench and the glowing screen of his tablet. They were hunting for a loophole, a crack in the armor, some legal technicality that would allow them to argue that Clarice P. Endeavor was a phantom entity, or better yet, a subsidiary of Julian's own making. But there was no crack. I had spent 18 months of grueling, caffeine-fueled nights ensuring that the foundation was made of reinforced steel. While Julian was out at the country club, nursing his third expensive bourbon and bragging to his sycophantic cronies about his aggressive restructuring and trimming the fat, I was in my home office, the one he never entered because it lacked a wet bar and a view of the golf course, meticulously rerouting the digital pipes of our life's work. He had moved the assets into Aegis Holdings thinking it was his private lifeboat, a way to strip Sterling Logistics of its liquid value before the divorce settlement could even be drafted. He thought he was being clever, using a labyrinthine series of offshore intermediaries in the Caymans and Luxembourg to mask the paper trail. What he hadn't realized was that I had established those very intermediaries years ago as part of our original global expansion strategy. He hadn't created anything new. He had simply followed the breadcrumbs I'd laid out for him like a starving animal. He had walked himself right into the vault and locked the heavy door from the inside, never pausing to check whose name was actually on the deed to the building. "Your Honor," Thorne finally began, his voice lacking its usual predatory resonance. It was thin, reedy, the sound of a man realizing he was standing on a trapdoor. There appears to be a significant clerical misunderstanding regarding the beneficial ownership of the Aegis accounts. My client was under the explicit impression that these were designated as personal executive holdings, partitioned from the marital estate through prior corporate agreements. Judge Vance didn't even look up from the filings. She was a woman of 60 with eyes like flint, a woman who had undoubtedly seen 1,000 Julians pass through her courtroom, men who mistook their wives' quiet competence for simple absence. She adjusted her reading glasses, the delicate silver chain clinking softly against the silk of her black robe. Mr. Thorne, the documentation provided by the court-appointed forensic auditors is quite explicit. It is also, I might add, impeccably organized. Claris P. Endeavor is not a holding entity for Mr. Sterling. It is the parent company, and according to the verified articles of incorporation, which were filed and stamped 3 fiscal years ago, this entity holds the absolute voting majority for every subsidiary currently being contested in this room, including Sterling Logistics. I watched Julian's face. It was a fascinating, gruesome study in the erosion of a man's soul. The expensive tan seemed to sallow into a sickly gray, the sharp, arrogant line of his jaw softening into something weak and trembling. He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time in years. There was no contempt in his eyes now, no sneer of superiority. There was only a frantic, animalistic confusion. He was searching for the woman who used to make his coffee, the one who fixed his spreadsheets and smoothed over his temper tantrums with clients. He was looking for the woman who took his insults with a quiet nod and went back to work in the shadows. He couldn't find her. Instead, he found the woman who had built his empire and had finally decided it was time to move the furniture. I remembered the night 6 months ago when he'd come home smelling of that cloying floral perfume, the one that wasn't mine, and told me I was redundant. He'd laughed, a dry, rasping sound that caught in his throat, and said that the board felt the company had outgrown my boutique sensibilities. He offered me a severance package that was an insult to the 20 years of my life I'd poured into the firm, a pittance intended to keep me in a quiet apartment somewhere far away from his new life. I hadn't argued. I hadn't cried or thrown the light crystal decanter at his head, though the urge had been a physical ache in my chest. I had simply waited for him to sign the final transfer papers for Aegis, the ones he thought were his golden parachute. He'd signed them with that same gold signet ring I'd bought back for him, pressing it into the documents with a flourish of triumph. He'd signed away the very air he breathed, and he'd done it with a smile of pure, unadulterated malice. Now, the courtroom was so quiet I could hear the rhythmic, mechanical click of the wall clock. It sounded like a countdown or perhaps a heart monitor flatlining. Julian reached for the water carafe on the table, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He missed the glass on his first attempt, the water splashing loudly onto the polished mahogany. A small, dark stain spread across the wood, echoing the way his influence was bleeding out of the room. He was a king without a country, standing in a palace I had designed to be his prison. I didn't feel joy exactly. Joy was too light a word for this. It was something heavier, something more like the settling of a long overdue debt, the closing of a ledger that had been written in red for far too long. I felt the weight of every late night, every dismissed idea, and every stolen credit finally finding its balance. Mr. Sterling, Judge Vance said, her voice cutting through his burgeoning panic like a scalpel. Do you have any documentation whatsoever that contradicts the filing for the Endeavor Group? Anything at all that suggests you have a legal claim to the assets you've been attempting to shield from these proceedings. Julian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Thorne, but the lawyer was already looking away, his posture shifting as he began the mental process of distancing himself from a sinking ship. Julian was alone. He was finished, just as he had promised I would be. The irony was a cold, sharp blade, and I let it rest against his throat in the heavy, suffocating silence of that room. He had forgotten that I knew where every body was buried, mostly because I was the one who had dug the graves and written the epitaphs. He had thought he was the master of the house, never realizing I was the one who owned the land it was built on. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. Julian's lawyer, Thorne, cleared his throat, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He didn't look at Julian, he looked at his own manicured cuticles, perhaps calculating how much of his retainer he could realistically keep. I let the moment breathe. I wanted every person in that room to taste the metallic tang of Julian's failure. My mind drifted back to the rainy Tuesday months ago when this final trap had been set. It had been a different kind of silence then, the muffled, humid quiet of the rusty spoon, a diner 3 towns over where the coffee tasted like burnt beans and the booth smelled of stale cigarette smoke from a decade ago. That was where I met Marcus. Marcus didn't look like a man who could dismantle a multi-million-dollar empire with a few keystrokes. He looked like a librarian who had spent too much time in the archives. His sweaters always had a faint dusting of lint, and his glasses were perpetually sliding down a nose that had been broken in some forgotten childhood scuffle. But behind those thick lenses were the eyes of a predator, albeit a very patient one. He was a forensic accountant with a specialty in what he called corporate archaeology. He didn't just look at balance sheets, he looked for the ghosts haunting them. We called our plan the Gray Ghost Strategy. It was an exercise in absolute invisibility, while Julian was busy playing the role of the titan of industry, hosting lavish galas for his mistress, Elena, and purchasing a fleet of Italian sports cars he didn't know how to drive. Marcus and I were moving through the shadows. We began by identifying the weak points in Vanguard's capital structure. Julian had become addicted to leverage. He treated debt like a renewable resource, a bottomless well he could dip into whenever his lifestyle outpaced his actual liquid assets. Every time he took a high-interest loan to fund a new vanity project, a boutique hotel in the Hamptons that never opened, or a tech startup that was little more than an app for dog walkers, he was unknowingly signing his life over to me. Marcus facilitated the creation of Astria Holdings. I chose the name because Astria was the goddess of justice, the last of the immortals to live among humans during the golden age before the world turned to iron. Julian, of course, never bothered to investigate. He likely thought it was just another generic, prestigious-sounding name concocted by a law firm. Through a series of nested shell companies, each one more opaque than the last, Astria began purchasing Vanguard's debt. We bought it at a discount from banks that were growing nervous about Julian's erratic behavior and his increasingly thin margins. It was a slow, methodical process, like a spider wrapping its prey in silk. Marcus was a master of the mundane. He could make a hostile takeover look like a series of clerical errors. While Julian was loud, demanding, and prone to histrionics, Marcus was a portrait of quiet competence. He never raised his voice, never bragged. He simply showed me the spreadsheets, his finger tracing the lines of red that were slowly turning into my black. I watched as Julian's vanity projects became my collateral. I watched as the very air he breathed the office space, the equipment, the intellectual property, became the property of a woman he had dismissed as redundant. The irony was that Julian had provided all the ammunition himself. His arrogance was his greatest blind spot. He assumed that because I was his wife, I was an extension of his will, a quiet satellite orbiting his sun. He never imagined that the satellite had its own gravity or that I had spent 20 years learning every inch of the terrain he thought he ruled. Now back in the courtroom, that gravity was finally pulling him down. He looked at me, his mouth working silently like a fish gasping on a pier. The gray ghost had finally materialized, and she was holding the deed to everything he owned. I leaned back slightly in my chair, the leather creaking softly, and met his gaze with a terrifying, absolute calm. The man who had laughed and told me I was finished was now realizing that the finish line was a cliff, and I was the one who had pushed him over the edge. I believe, I said, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the heavy air, that the question of ownership is no longer a matter of debate. The documents provided to the court and verified by the SEC show that Astria Holdings, of which I am the sole proprietor, acquired the majority of Vanguard's outstanding debt obligations 6 weeks ago. When Mr. Sterling missed the balloon payment on the logistics expansion, he triggered a default clause that allowed for an immediate debt for equity swap. In simpler terms, Julian, you don't work for yourself anymore. You work for me. Or rather, you would if I hadn't already decided to terminate your position for cause. Julian's face went from gray to a mottled, angry purple. He surged forward, his hands slamming onto the table, but the bailiff was already moving toward him. "This is a lie," he screamed, the sound echoing harshly off the marble walls. "This is some kind of trick. You can't take what's mine." "It was never yours, Julian," I replied, watching a single bead of sweat roll down his temple. "You just held the keys for a while. I'm the one who built the locks." Judge Vance banged her gavel, a sharp, final crack that seemed to signal the end of an era. "Order, Mr. Sterling, sit down. Counsel, I suggest you take a moment with your client. We will recess for 30 minutes to review these filings in chambers. But I will warn you now, if these signatures are indeed verified, this court will have no choice but to recognize the transfer of assets as binding." As the courtroom began to stir, a low hum of whispers rising like a swarm of bees, I stayed seated. I watched Julian collapse back into his chair, his head in his hands. He looked small. For the first time in my life, he looked completely and utterly insignificant. I felt a hand on my shoulder, Marcus, who had slipped into the room unnoticed during the commotion. He didn't say a word, just gave a single firm nod. The librarian had finished his work, and the library was now mine. The silence that followed the judge's exit was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized, the kind of silence that precedes a structural collapse. Julian remained slumped in his chair, his broad shoulders, once the very image of executive vitality, now appearing brittle, as if the expensive wool of his suit was the only thing holding his frame together. His lawyer, a man whose retainer could have funded a small hospital, was whispering frantically into his ear, but Julian wasn't listening. He was staring at the mahogany table, his eyes fixed on the stack of documents that had just dismantled his life. I watched him from my seat, my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling a strange, clinical detachment. For so long, I had been the spectator of his life, the quiet observer of his triumphs and his cruelties. Now, the roles had reversed with a violence that even I hadn't fully anticipated. To reach this moment, I had spent the last 3 years perfecting the most difficult role of my life, the diminished wife. It was a performance that required a master's degree in psychological camouflage. I had deliberately let my appearance slide into a sort of curated neglect. I stopped visiting the high-end salon on Fifth Avenue, allowing the silver at my temples to bloom into a streak of gray that I knew Julian found distasteful. I swapped my tailored Italian silks for cardigans that were a shade too beige, skirts that hit at an unflattering length, and shoes designed for comfort rather than conquest. I wanted him to look at me and see a woman who had given up, a woman who had finally been broken by his indifference and the weight of a 20-year marriage that had turned into a cold war. I became a ghost in my own home, moving through the rooms with a look of confused hurt perpetually etched onto my face. Whenever he spoke about the business, about the vultures at the banks or the idiots on his board, I would tilt my head and offer a vapid, supportive smile, nodding as if the terms he used were a foreign language I was struggling to translate. I remember one dinner party in particular, about 8 months ago, held at our penthouse for a group of his most influential investors. The room was filled with the scent of expensive cigars and even more expensive ego. Julian was in his element, holding court near the floor to ceiling windows that overlooked the city he thought he owned. I was circulating with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, playing the part of the gracious, if somewhat dim-witted, hostess. One of the investors, a man named Henderson who had always looked at me with a mixture of pity and boredom, asked me what I thought about the recent volatility in the logistics sector. Before I could even open my mouth, Julian let out a sharp, barking laugh and draped a heavy arm across my shoulders. The weight of it was stifling, a possessive gesture that felt more like a leash than an embrace. "Oh, don't bother asking Alina," Julian had said, his voice dripping with a casual, practiced cruelty that made the other men chuckle. "My wife's commercial instincts are about as sharp as a butter knife. She's much more concerned with the color of the drapes than the fluctuation of the markets." "Aren't you, sweetheart?" He squeezed my shoulder then, a hard, bruising grip that was meant to keep me grounded, to keep me small. I felt the sting of their collective pity, a hot flush of feigned embarrassment rising to my cheeks. I looked down at my sensible shoes, playing the part of the humiliated spouse to perfection. But internally, beneath the layer of beige wool and graying hair, I was a machine of pure calculation. Even as he mocked me, I was mentally running the numbers on the mezzanine financing I had secured that morning through a secondary shell company. I was calculating the exact interest rate spread that would eventually choke his cash flow, and I was timing the countdown until his hand would never have the right to touch me again. Every insult he hurled was another brick in the wall of his own prison. Now, in the courtroom, the air felt thin. I could see the sweat staining the collar of Julian's shirt, a detail he would have been mortified by under any other circumstances. He finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot, searching my face for some remnant of the woman he thought he knew. He was looking for the diminished wife, the one who would surely tell him this was all a mistake, a clerical error, a joke gone too far. But that woman was gone. She had never really existed. In her place sat the architect of his ruin, a woman who had used his own hubris as the blueprint for her revenge. I didn't smile. A smile would have been too small for a victory this absolute. I simply sat there, a portrait of terrifying, absolute calm, watching as the man who had laughed at my lack of instincts realized that I had been the one hunting him all along. The gray ghost hadn't just materialized. She had taken over the house, and Julian was finally realizing he was the one who was truly finished. The silence in the courtroom was a physical weight, a pressurized chamber where the only sound was the frantic, shallow thrum of Julian's breathing. But as I sat there, watching the realization crawl across his face like a slow-moving stain, my mind drifted back to the quiet that had preceded this storm. To Julian, those months had been a period of my decline, a slow fading of the woman he once feared. To me, they were a masterclass in architectural destruction. I had rented a 400 square foot studio in a crumbling brick building in Long Island City, a place where the elevator groaned with the effort of every floor and the hallways smelled of boiled cabbage and industrial cleaner. It was a far cry from the marble and glass of our penthouse, but it was the only place I felt truly awake. In that room, the paper trail was my only companion, and it was a work of art. I spent nights huddled over a folding card table, the only light coming from the harsh blue-white glare of three monitors that I had set up myself. I remember the sensory grit of those hours with a clarity that the courtroom's sterile air couldn't touch. There was the constant clanking wheeze of the baseboard heater, a rhythmic metallic tapping that timed my pulse. The air was always slightly too dry, making my eyes itch as I scoured thousands of lines of code and corporate filings. I lived on bitter, lukewarm coffee that had long since lost its heat, the acidic tang staining the back of my throat, a constant reminder of the grit required for this level of subversion. The spreadsheets were my constellations. In the dark of that studio, the glowing cells looked like stars, a map of a universe I was slowly dismantling. I would sit there for 18 hours at a time, my back aching in a way that felt like a badge of honor, watching the leverage shift. I wasn't just taking my half of the marital assets, I was positioning myself to own the entire board piece by agonizing piece. Julian, in his infinite, arrogant hubris, had decided to play a dangerous game. To ensure he looked as lean as possible for the divorce while simultaneously trying to inflate the stock price of his primary firm to impress the board, he began a series of aggressive, poorly researched acquisitions. He wanted to show growth, to show that he was the engine of the company, and that I was merely a passenger he was finally offloading. He didn't realize that the sellers of those boutique logistics firms and tech startups were all subsidiaries of Astria, a holding company I had established through a labyrinthine series of offshore trusts and blind proxies. Every time he thought he was winning a negotiation, every time he bragged at dinner about gutting a competitor for pennies on the dollar, he was actually funneling his remaining liquidity directly into my hands. He was buying his own ruin and calling it a victory. I remember the exact moment at 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday when I saw the final piece of the puzzle click into place. I had been cross-referencing the voting rights of the newly acquired subsidiaries against the master charter of his parent company. I realized then that I didn't just have a claim to his wealth. I controlled 49% of the voting shares, hidden behind a dozen layers of corporate veil. I was the majority of the minority, the shadow in his boardroom that he had never bothered to look for because he was too busy looking at my unflattering hemlines and drab cardigans. I had become the ghost in his machine. That night, I didn't celebrate with champagne. I simply leaned back in my cheap plastic chair, listened to the distant hum of the 7 train rattling the windows, and felt the cold, hard thrill of absolute leverage. I had spent 20 years being the woman behind the man, but in that dusty studio, I became the woman who would replace him. Now, as I looked at him in the courtroom, his face pale and his ego shattered, I realized that the butter knife he had mocked was actually a scalpel, and I had already finished the surgery before he even felt the first cut. He was looking for a wife to plead with. He found the owner of his life instead. The silence in the courtroom was not a void. It was a physical weight pressing down on the polished mahogany tables and the buffed marble floors. It was the kind of silence that precedes a controlled demolition, the split second after the charges have been set but before the dust begins to rise. Julian sat across from me, his mouth slightly agape, the smirk he had worn like a suit of armor for the last decade finally cracking. I watched a single bead of sweat break from his hairline and track a jagged path down his temple, disappearing into the collar of his $3,000 shirt. He looked smaller than he had 5 minutes ago. The bravado that usually filled his chest, making him seem like the most important man in any room, had evaporated, leaving behind a hollowed out husk of a man who was only just beginning to grasp the magnitude of his error. His lead attorney, Marcus Sterling, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was built on the wreckage of women less prepared than I, was fumbling with his spectacles. His hands, usually so steady they could perform clockwork repair, were trembling as he leafed through the addendum I had just submitted to the court. The sound of the paper rustling was deafening in the stillness. It was a crisp, sharp sound like the snapping of dry kindling. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded atop my own modest folder, my spine a straight line of iron. I didn't need to look at the documents to know what they said. I knew every comma, every sub-clause, and every hidden provision by heart. I had lived within those words for months, breathing them in like oxygen, while Julian was busy breathing in the perfume of his latest executive assistant. "Your Honor," Sterling finally stammered, his voice an octave higher than usual, This is a blatant misrepresentation of assets. These holdings, Astria, we had no record of these being tied to the marital estate. Judge Halloway, a woman whose face was a map of hard-won wisdom and little patience for theatrics, leaned forward. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, moved from the documents to Julian's pale face and then finally to me. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice a low, rhythmic rumble, "it appears the lack of record was due to your client's own aggressive attempts to shield his liquidity through these very subsidiaries. It seems he was so intent on hiding his wealth from his wife that he failed to notice she was the one providing the shadows." Julian finally found his voice, though it sounded like it was being squeezed out of a rusted pipe. "This is a trick," he hissed, leaning over the table, his eyes darting toward me with a mixture of hatred and burgeoning terror. You don't have the capital, you're a housewife, Evelyn. You spent the last year complaining about the humidity and buying vintage linens. You don't own Vanguard. I built that company from the dirt." I didn't flinch. I let his words hang in the air, a testament to the very arrogance that had blinded him. I thought back to the vintage linens I had supposedly been obsessed with. He didn't realize that the linens were actually coded ledgers I had been smuggling out of his home office under the guise of spring cleaning. He hadn't noticed that the humidity I complained about was the heat generated by the servers I had running in that cramped Long Island City studio, churning through the data packets I'd intercepted from his unsecured home network. He had seen a woman shrinking into the background, a fading wallpaper rose, while I was actually a vine, growing quietly in the dark, wrapping myself around the foundations of his empire until I was the only thing holding it up and the only thing that could pull it down. "I didn't build it, Julian," I said, my voice calm and conversational, a stark contrast to his frantic rasp. "I just bought the debt you used to expand it." "You were so focused on the penthouse view that you forgot to check who owned the land the building was sitting on. You signed the final bridge loan for the acquisition of North Star Logistics 3 weeks ago. Do you remember who the lead creditor was on that contract? It was a private equity firm called Hesperides." I paused, watching him blink, his mind frantically trying to connect the dots. "Hesperides is a wholly owned subsidiary of Astria," I continued, the words feeling like silk on my tongue. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, due to the default triggers you tripped by moving capital into your offshore accounts to hide it from this divorce, I have exercised the right to convert that debt into equity, controlling equity. You didn't just lose the company to a stranger, Julian. You handed me the keys and thanked me for the privilege while you were serving me papers at my mother's birthday lunch. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving him a ghastly, translucent gray. He looked at his legal team, but they were already looking away, their professional instincts telling them that the ship wasn't just sinking, it had already hit the bottom of the trench. The finished woman he had mocked was now the only person in the world who could decide if he even had a desk to go back to tomorrow. I felt a strange, cold peace. It wasn't the fiery heat of revenge, but the clinical satisfaction of a job well done. I had dismantled him not with a sledgehammer, but with the very tools he had used to build his cage of lies. I was no longer the passenger, I was the storm. Julian's mouth opened and closed, a silent, rhythmic motion that reminded me of a landed fish gasping for the very element that was killing it. He looked at Sterling, but Sterling was busy meticulously aligning his pens, refusing to meet his client's gaze. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, a heavy, velvet weight that pressed against my eardrums. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the distant, muffled siren of an ambulance on the street below, but inside this wood-paneled sanctum, time had frozen around the wreckage of Julian's ego. I noticed the way the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, tiny, chaotic particles that seemed more organized than Julian's defense at that moment. Judge Holloway didn't rush the moment. She spent several minutes that must have felt like centuries to Julian, flipping through the thick blue-bound folders Marcus had provided. Her reading glasses, perched on the bridge of her nose, reflected the harsh fluorescent lights masking her eyes. Finally, she looked up, her expression unreadable but her eyes gleaming with a terrifying, clinical clarity. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice cutting through the stagnant air like a blade through silk. "The court finds these documents to be prima facie valid. The debt to equity conversion appears to have been executed in accordance with the covenants of the North Star acquisition, covenants, I might add, that your client personally initialed and notarized. If there is a dispute regarding the legitimacy of Astria's holdings, that is a matter for a separate civil litigation. However, for the purposes of this distribution of marital assets, the reality is clear. The defendant's primary asset, Vanguard, is currently a subsidiary of the plaintiff's holding company. In simpler terms, Mr. Sterling, your client is an employee of a firm his wife now controls." Julian let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. It was a dry, rattling noise, the sound of a man realizing the ground he stood on was actually a trapdoor. "You let her do this," he whispered, his voice trembling as he looked at Sterling. "You were supposed to protect the interests. You told me she was nothing. You told me she was a flight risk, not a predator." His hands, usually so steady when he was firing executives or signing multi-million-dollar deals, were shaking so violently that he had to grip the edge of the mahogany table. Sterling didn't look up. He was a shark who had sensed blood in the water and realized it was his own. "Julian, we were working with the financial disclosures you provided. We had no way of knowing you were borrowing against your own hidden accounts via a third-party shell. You didn't just hide the money from her, you hid the trail from us." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the cool, stiff leather against my spine. It was the first time in the entire proceedings that I hadn't felt the need to shrink, to make myself smaller so as not to draw his ire. I looked past Julian toward the back of the room where Marcus sat. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply adjusted his glasses and looked down at his tablet, his face a mask of professional indifference. He was the architect of the digital shadows, the one who had helped me navigate the labyrinth of Julian's greed, but I was the one who had walked through the fire to get here. It's called piercing the corporate veil, Julian, I said softly, my voice steady and devoid of the theatrical stutter I'd used during the depositions. But in this case, you didn't even have a veil. You had a shroud, and you were so busy wrapping me in it that you didn't realize you were the one inside. You thought I was a passenger in your life, a decorative fixture you could upgrade or discard. You forgot that I was the one who kept the books for the first 5 years. I knew where you hid the spare keys to the kingdom because I'm the one who bought the locks. I watched a single bead of sweat roll down his temple, carving a path through the expensive bronzer he used to maintain his vibrant CEO look. He looked old. For the first time in 20 years, I saw the man he actually was without the scaffolding of his wealth and his perceived brilliance. He was a small, frightened boy who had built a mountain of paper and called it a kingdom, never realizing that paper burns. The smell of his expensive cologne, something with notes of sandalwood and arrogance, now seemed cloying and pathetic like flowers at a funeral. I want an injunction, Julian suddenly barked, his voice cracking on the last syllable. He stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the polished floorboards with a sound that made everyone in the room flinch. Your Honor, this is bad faith. This is a coordinated attack on a public entity. She's trying to destroy the livelihoods of 300 employees just to spite me. This is personal vendetta masquerading as business. Judge Holloway raised a single, perfectly groomed eyebrow, her gaze flat and unimpressed. Mr. Vane, sit down. Your concern for your employees is noted, though it seems a bit late given that the forensic accountants have already flagged your attempts to strip the company's pension fund to finance your offshore relocation 2 months ago. If anyone has acted in bad faith, the record suggests it began long before Mrs. Vane acquired your debt. You were preparing to leave her with nothing. It appears she simply ensured that nothing was a mirror of your own making. She closed the folder with a definitive thwack that echoed like a gunshot. We are adjourned for 1 hour. I suggest you and your counsel use this time to reconsider your settlement position. Mrs. Vane's team has made it very clear that they are no longer interested in a percentage of the assets. They own the assets. The question now is how much of your personal freedom you're willing to trade to keep the SEC from opening the boxes I'm currently looking at. Julian collapsed back into his seat, the air leaving his lungs in a long, defeated hiss. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that he seemed to be suffering from a kind of psychological bends. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit, a garment he had once told me made me look severe and unapproachable. I had worn it today for that very reason. I reached for my handbag, the heavy gold chain clinking softly, a sound of metallic finality. I felt light, almost buoyant, as if the gravity of the room no longer applied to me. Evelyn, he whispered as I turned to leave. It was the first time he'd used my name without a sneer or a patronizing lilt in over a decade. Evie, please, we can talk about this. We can find a way to manage this together. I know I've been difficult, but you can't do this alone. You don't know the first thing about running a conglomerate like Vanguard. You'll tank the stock in a week. I paused, looking down at him. I saw the desperation, the calculated attempt to pivot back into the role of the mentor, the protector. He still thought there was a we. He still thought I needed his permission to exist, his hand to guide me through the world of men and money. It was a delusion so deep that even the wreckage of his life couldn't shatter it. You're right, Julian, I said, a small, genuine smile finally touching my lips, a smile that felt like it had been decades in the making. I don't know how to run Vanguard the way you did. I don't know how to cook the books or how to intimidate subordinates until they quit or how to lie to a board of directors while sleeping with the lead counsel's daughter, but I do know how to liquidate and I know how to identify a liability. I leaned in closer until I could smell the stale scotch he'd clearly had for breakfast to steady his nerves. Consider this your notice. You're redundant. In fact, you're an expense we can no longer afford to carry. I walked away then, the rhythmic click of my heels on the marble floor sounding like a ticking clock marking the end of an era. I didn't look back. I had spent 20 years looking back, wondering where I'd gone wrong, wondering why my devotion hadn't been enough to earn his respect. As I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the hallway, the bright, unfiltered light of the afternoon sun flooded the space, blinding and beautiful. Marcus was waiting for me near the elevators, his phone already pressed to his ear, his expression focused. The board is calling an emergency session for 2 p.m., he said, falling into step beside me without missing a beat. They've seen the filings we leaked to the wire. They're terrified, Evelyn. They're looking for a sacrificial lamb. Good, I said, breathing in the air of the hallway, which smelled of floor wax, old paper, and the sweet, electric scent of victory. Let them be terrified. It's a very motivating emotion for men who have spent their lives feeling safe. Tell them I'll be there at 2:15. I want them to have 15 minutes to imagine the worst possible outcome before I walk in and give it to them. We walked toward the elevators, two figures in a sea of frantic legal aides, reporters, and bailiffs. I felt the weight of the company, the weight of the future, and for the first time in my life, it didn't feel like a burden that would crush me. It felt like a foundation I had built with my own hands, brick by hidden brick. Julian had always thought he was the sun, the center of the universe around which everything else was forced to orbit. He hadn't realized that the moon is the one that controls the tides, and the tide had finally, irrevocably come in. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and as I stepped inside, I caught my reflection in the polished brass. I didn't recognize the woman looking back, not because she was a stranger, but because I hadn't seen her in 20 years. She looked like someone who was just getting started. The elevator doors opened to the lobby, and the transition from the courthouse to the sleek black car waiting at the curb was a blur of flashing cameras and shouted questions I had no intention of answering. Marcus held the door for me, and as I slid onto the cool, obsidian leather of the backseat, the silence of the cabin felt like a physical weight, a sudden and welcome decompression. The city moved past the tinted windows in a smear of gray and glass, but my mind was already several miles ahead, inside the glass and steel monolith of the Vanguard headquarters. Marcus remained silent, his fingers dancing across a tablet, finalizing the last of the digital filings. He knew I didn't need small talk. I needed the cold, hard data of the coup. My thoughts drifted back to Elias, the man who had been the architect of Julian's financial structure for nearly a decade. Julian had always treated Elias like a piece of office equipment, reliable, quiet, and easily replaced if he started to malfunction. He mocked Elias' meticulous nature, his penchant for starch-stiff shirts, and the way he blinked rapidly when he was nervous. Julian called him the calculator to his face, a nickname intended to strip him of his humanity. What Julian never understood was that a man who spends his life looking at the fine print sees everything the man at the podium misses. 3 months ago, in the dead of night, Elias and I had shared a secure video call that changed the trajectory of this entire war. I can still see the blue light of the screen reflecting off his glasses, making him look like a ghost in his own darkened office. He hadn't asked for a bribe. He hadn't even asked for a promotion in the new regime. He had simply leaned into the camera and whispered, "He's going to bankrupt us all just to prove he's the smartest man in the room, Evelyn. I can't let him take the pension funds down with him." In that moment, we had formed a silent pact. While Julian was busy hiring private investigators to track my movements and high-priced consultants to hide his personal assets, Elias and I were performing a far more delicate surgery. We were moving the debt. Vanguard had been leveraged to the hilt to fund Julian's ego-driven acquisitions in the tech sector, acquisitions that were bleeding cash. Under Elia's guidance, I had spent the last year quietly purchasing that debt through a series of shell companies that Julian assumed were friendly vulture funds waiting to bail him out. The final tranches had been converted into equity the moment the judge's gavel hit the bench this morning. The steel jaws I had envisioned weren't made of metal. They were made of lines of code and digital signatures that Julian hadn't even known existed. The CFO had spent the last 48 hours sending frantic, scripted emails to Julian, complaining about technical glitches and delayed wire transfers to keep him distracted. In reality, Elias was clearing the path for my arrival. "Elias just messaged," Marcus said, breaking the silence as we pulled into the underground parking garage of the Vanguard building. "The board is in the conference room on the 42nd floor. Julian's lead counsel is trying to gain entry, but security has been instructed to deny access to anyone not on the updated shareholder registry." "And the registry is updated?" I asked, my voice steady, though my heart was beginning to hammer against my ribs. "As of 10 minutes ago," Marcus confirmed, a predatory glint in his eye. "You are the majority shareholder of record, Evelyn. You own 51% of the voting stock Julian owns." "Well, technically, he owns a very expensive collection of lawsuits and a desk he's about to be escorted away from." I stepped out of the car, the air in the garage smelling of exhaust and ozone. I looked up at the concrete ceiling, feeling the literal tons of steel and glass pressing down above me. For years, this building had been a fortress I wasn't allowed to enter without an invitation, a place where Julian went to be the king I wasn't allowed to know. I adjusted the lapel of my jacket, feeling the sharp edges of my own resolve. As we walked toward the private express elevator, I caught a glimpse of Elias through the glass partition of the lobby's security hub. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply gave me a short, sharp nod, a soldier acknowledging a general. He had done his part. He had opened the gates from the inside. Now it was time for me to walk through them and claim the ruins. The elevator chime rang out, a high, clear note that sounded like a bell tolling for the man I had once loved and the man I was about to destroy. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the 42nd floor, and watched the world below disappear. The ascent was silent, save for the faint, rhythmic hum of the elevator's motor and the soft whistle of air rushing past the car. As the floor indicator ticked upward, 38, 39, 40, I watched my reflection in the polished chrome of the doors. The woman staring back at me didn't look like the ghost Julian had tried to turn me into. My eyes were clear, my posture unyielding, and the pearls at my throat felt less like jewelry and more like a string of small, hard victories. When the chime rang for the 42nd floor, my stomach did a slow, heavy roll, not from the motion, but from the sheer finality of what was about to happen. The doors slid open to reveal the inner sanctum of Vanguard Holdings. It was a space designed to intimidate, all floor-to-ceiling glass, dark Macassar ebony paneling, and a silence so thick it felt expensive. Sarah, Julian's longtime executive assistant, sat behind a monolithic marble desk. She looked up, her practiced professional smile faltering as she recognized me. She knew I wasn't supposed to be there. She knew the situation, as the office gossip surely called it. "Mrs. Thorne," she stammered, her hand hovering over the intercom. "I'm sorry, Julian is in court today and the board is in a private session. I can't. I'm not here to see Julian, Sarah," I said, my voice cutting through her hesitation like a blade through silk. I didn't stop walking. Marcus was a half step behind me, his briefcase a silent threat, and the board is exactly who I'm here to see. I pushed through the double, frosted glass doors of the main conference room. The air inside was warm and smelled of roasted coffee and the faint, metallic tang of nervous sweat. 12 men sat around a table that cost more than a suburban home, their heads bowed over tablets and spreadsheets. At the head of the table sat Arthur Sterling, the board chairman and a man who had toasted Julian at our wedding 30 years ago. The silence that greeted my entrance was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. "Evelyn," Arthur said, his voice a mixture of confusion and paternalistic annoyance. He started to rise, adjusting his spectacles. "This is a closed meeting. We are in the middle of discussing the liquidity crisis." "You can't just, the liquidity crisis is over, Arthur," I interrupted, walking to the foot of the table. I placed my hands flat on the cool wood, feeling the vibration of the city far below. "Or rather, it has changed hands. Marcus, if you would." Marcus stepped forward and began distributing folders, thick, heavy dossiers bound in navy blue. I watched the board members' faces as they opened them. I watched the way the blood drained from their cheeks, the way their eyes darted across the pages, searching for a loophole that didn't exist. These were the men who had looked through me for decades, who had assumed my only contribution to the company was choosing the color of the annual report's cover. "As of 9:00 a.m. this morning," I said, my voice growing steadier with every word, "the debt held by the shell companies you know as Aegis and North Star has been converted into voting equity. I hold 51%. This board is now dissolved, effective immediately, pending a full forensic audit of Julian's discretionary spending." Arthur looked as if he were having a stroke. This is a hostile takeover. Julian will have your head for this." I almost laughed. It was the same threat I had lived with for half my life. I leaned in, my face inches from his. "Julian is currently in a courtroom, lying to a judge about my mental competence. He thinks he's winning. He thinks he's finishing me." The memory of Julian's face in that courtroom, which I am sitting in right now, flashes across my mind. I look at him from my seat at the petitioner's table. He is on the stand, leaning toward the judge with that practiced, boyish charm that used to make me melt. He says the words again, "She's finished, Your Honor. She hasn't been a part of this company in a decade." He has no idea. He thinks I am the woman who stayed home and cried. He doesn't realize that while he was performing for the court, I was performing an exorcism on his empire. I watch him laugh, a sharp, barking sound of pure arrogance, and for the first time in 30 years, I don't feel a spark of fear. I feel a cold, crystalline pity. He is a man standing on a trapdoor, and I am the only one who knows the rope has already been cut. Marcus catches my eye and gives a microscopic nod. The documents are signed. The 42nd floor is mine. The company is mine, and Julian is just a man in a very expensive suit, talking to a room that has already stopped listening. Sarah rose from her seat with a fluidity that was almost predatory, her heels clicking against the linoleum with the rhythm of a ticking clock. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't need to. Her focus was entirely on Judge Holloway, a woman whose face was a map of decades spent navigating the lies of desperate men. Sarah reached into her briefcase and withdrew a set of navy blue dossiers, identical to the ones I had just left on the mahogany table of the Thorn Enterprises boardroom. She moved with the precision of a scalpel, handing one copy to the bailiff to be passed to the judge, and another to Julian's lead counsel, a man named Vance who had built his reputation on being an immovable object. I watched the air in the room change. It wasn't a sudden shift, but a slow, pressurized tightening. Julian was still leaning back, a smirk playing on his lips, his fingers drumming a jaunty rhythm on the table. He thought this was a formality. He thought Sarah was about to present more bank statements he'd already successfully scrubbed or hidden. He had spent months telling me, and anyone who would listen, that I was a relic of the past, a ghost haunting the halls of a company I no longer understood. "She's finished," he had whispered to Vance just minutes before, loud enough for the court reporter to hear. "She's just trying to claw back a life that doesn't belong to her anymore." "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice a cool, steady stream that seemed to lower the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. "The petitioner has spent the last hour testifying to his sole ownership and control over the Thorn corporate structure. He has characterized my client as a silent partner with no standing. We would like to introduce into evidence the certified ownership structure of Astria Holdings." Vance stood up, his voice booming with a practiced, hollow confidence. "Objection, Your Honor. Astria is a third-party creditor. It has no bearing on the marital assets currently under dispute." "On the contrary, Mr. Vance," Sarah said, not even turning to look at him. "Astria Holdings doesn't just hold the debt. As of 3 hours ago, Astria Holdings is the majority shareholder of Thorn Enterprises and all its subsidiaries." The judge looked over her spectacles, her eyes narrowing as she flipped open the first page of the dossier. The silence in the court became absolute, the kind of heavy, ringing quiet that follows a gunshot. I turned my head slowly to look at Julian. The transformation was breathtaking. The sun-tanned arrogance he had worn like a shield, a tan acquired on a business trip to Cabo that I knew for a fact was a tryst with his newest marketing director, began to fail him. It didn't just fade, it soured. A gray, sickly pallor crept up from his collar, turning his skin the color of wet ash. His mouth, which had been set in a triumphant line, hung slightly open, a small, involuntary twitch developing at the corner of his left eye. Sarah began to read, her voice clinical and devastating. She listed the names of the subsidiaries Julian had spent years burying in offshore accounts: Blue Horizon, North Star, the Aegis Group. She detailed the debt to equity conversions, the complex web of loans Julian had taken out to keep his lifestyle afloat, loans that had been quietly bought up by a shadow entity he never bothered to investigate because he was too busy admiring his own reflection. "And finally," Sarah said, her eyes finally snapping to Julian's, "the name of the sole director and majority shareholder of Astria Holdings, Evelyn Thorne." Julian's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that cut through the silence. He looked at the documents on the table in front of him as if they were vipers. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He was staring at the name, my name, printed in bold, black ink at the bottom of the corporate charter. The "you're finished" he had thrown at me earlier seemed to hang in the air between us, vibrating with a new, lethal irony. It wasn't my death knell, it was his. He wasn't just losing the house or the cars or the alimony. He was realizing in real time that the kingdom he had built on the bones of my labor now belonged to the woman he had dismissed as a footnote. He was a king without a crown, standing in a room full of people who were watching him dissolve. I felt no joy in it, only a profound, crystalline sense of equilibrium. The scale had finally leveled. I watched the frantic, hushed conversation between Julian and Vance, a desperate huddle of men who had spent their entire lives believing that the world was a game they were destined to win. Vance was no longer the immovable object. He was a man looking for an exit strategy, his eyes darting toward the judge as if searching for a loophole in the laws of physics. Julian, however, was motionless. The twitch in his eye had stopped, replaced by a vacant, glassy stare directed at the center of the mahogany table. He looked like a man who had been told the gravity he relied on had suddenly inverted. He wasn't just losing a company, he was losing the very ground he stood on, the foundation of his identity as a titan of industry. The "you're finished" he had thrown at me was now a ghost, a hollow echo of a man who didn't realize he had been bankrupt long before he walked into this room. The judge cleared her throat, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the stagnant air. "The court will take a 30-minute recess to review these documents," she announced, her voice devoid of its earlier skepticism. She didn't look at Julian. She looked at me, a brief, assessing glance that acknowledged the shift in the room's power dynamic. As she rose and exited through the rear door, the tension didn't break, it merely changed shape. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my charcoal suit. Sarah caught my eye and gave a singular, sharp nod, the silent salute of a general who had just won the decisive battle. I didn't wait for Julian to find his voice. I didn't need to hear his excuses, his threats, or the inevitable, pathetic attempts at negotiation that I knew were coming. I turned my back on the wreckage of his ego and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. The hallway was a cathedral of marble and muffled whispers, but I didn't stop until I pushed through the final set of brass-handled doors and stepped out into the afternoon. The transition was visceral. I walked out of the courthouse into a crisp, bright afternoon that felt like a baptism. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of late autumn and the metallic tang of the city, but it was clean. The sun felt different on my skin, no longer a spotlight exposing my vulnerabilities, but a warmth that seemed to soak into my very marrow. For years, I had moved through the world as if I were underwater, my movements slowed by the weight of Julian's expectations and the constant, crushing pressure of his gaslighting. Now that pressure was gone. I reached into my leather bag, my fingers brushing against the heavy brass ring of keys. They weren't just the keys to the Vanguard headquarters or the executive suite. They were the physical manifestation of a reclamation. I didn't view them as a burden or a trophy. They were a tool. I thought of the employees at Vanguard, the mid-level managers who had watched Julian gut the pension funds, the administrative assistants who had endured his volatile temper, the creative teams whose ideas he had stolen and rebranded as his own. They had been terrified, whispered rumors of layoffs and bankruptcy haunting the break rooms for months. Julian had treated the company like a personal ATM, a way to fund a lifestyle that was as hollow as his promises. I felt a sudden, fierce sense of responsibility. I wasn't going back there to settle scores or to enjoy the view from the top floor. I was going back to rebuild. I had plans, spreadsheets, and restructuring models I'd been perfecting in the dark hours of the night while Julian was out closing deals. I knew every crack in the foundation of that company because I was the one who had helped lay the first bricks while he was still learning how to tie a silk tie. I was not a broken wife seeking alimony, nor was I the silent partner he could relegate to the footnotes of his biography. I was the owner. As I walked toward the curb to hail a cab, I caught my reflection in the polished glass of the courthouse doors. The woman staring back at me wasn't the one who had walked in 3 hours ago. Her shoulders were square, her gaze was level, and the shadows that had lived under her eyes for a decade seemed to have evaporated in the afternoon light. I looked like a woman who had just finished a long, grueling marathon, only to realize she was standing at the starting line of a much more important race. I looked like a woman who had finally, decisively begun. The yellow cab pulled up to the curb, and as I stepped inside, the driver caught my eye in the rearview mirror. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked. "Thorn Enterprises," I said, the name tasting like iron and victory. "And don't rush, I want to see the city."